Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Foundry Live. My name is Elise. I am part of Foundry's industry marketing team and will be your virtual host today. I'm joined by Foundry's Chris Weatherly, Product Manager for Compositing and Finishing, and Jonathan Egstad, Senior Product Innovation Manager. And today they'll be discussing Nuke 14's new 3D system. Would you two like to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. Thank you all for joining this webinar. Really excited to be going over some of the 3D system discussion stuff today. So a little bit about me, if you've never seen my face before. I work on the Nuke team as a product manager. I've been working with Foundry close to 8 years now. And before that, I was a lighting and compositing artist, working on shows like Guardians of the Galaxy is the last one that I really liked. But yeah, so excited to sort of have the discussion with you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Egstad. I've been with Foundry for only 2 years now. Before that, I worked in visual effects production for many, many years and have been using Nuke since the 1990s from Digital Domain and helped steer and develop Nuke while it was at Digital Domain. So for over many years of production work. So.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. Just so everybody knows, the session will end with a live Q&A. So if you have any session or questions for the group, please add them to the questions tab at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to mention that today's session is part of Foundry Live, our virtual event series. And over the month of February, we've hosted 5 great sessions, all of which will be on YouTube shortly for you to catch on demand. So please keep an eye out for that. And finally, I'd like to thank Dell, Intel, and NVIDIA for powering Foundry Live and their continued support as technology partners.
Cool. So in a little bit, we're going to switch over to going through the discussion. But to start with, we're actually going to just introduce the new 3D system that was released in 14 as a beta feature. This is because we're aware some people in the room might not have had a chance to play with it. And we think it's good to get a small idea of what it's like, a small overview of the 3D system, so that in the discussion you can have some context for what we're talking about.
Perfect. So we'll get started. I hope everybody enjoys, and we'll see you on the other side for the Q&A.
See you then.
Okay, so I'm just going to run through a quick introduction of the new 3D system in Nuke 14. To start off with, if you come to the 3D tab, you can see that the new 3D system is a beta feature. So we have a lot of new nodes all in beta, but we still have the classic system, so both systems running in parallel. So you can continue working how you've always used to while starting to explore and learn the new system, and we can start to introduce production level workflows that come out of beta as the series continues. So let's start really simple. First off, the goal of the 3D system is to really give you greater performance at scale while retaining that intuitiveness for artists within the compositing workspace. We want this to feel like home for you as 3D artists in a compositing space. But we also want to lay the groundwork, that architecture for future workflows. Now, it should really feel familiar to you though, so we're going to start with the basic stuff. So a geo card, the new nodes typically have geo as the prefix, and just a checkerboard coming into it. And as you can see, we have that in our new system. We can then add a sphere and a cylinder and a cube. But you may notice a couple of things which are different. The main obvious one is this new scene graph. So here we can come in and you can see we have a whole range of the geosphere, the geocylinder, all of these things, and I can select them in the scene graph and have them correspond in the viewer, and vice versa. And the other thing is a path knob. Now the path knob is important because this is what determines where your objects live in your scene graph hierarchy. So this brings Nuke in line with other DCCs in terms of you have a hierarchical structure now, and I can go in and I can modify essentially the name and the location. So you can see here card, card 1, card, and now that's where this lives inside of my scene graph. Another thing is the image input. This is now tied as a hidden input to the right of the node. This is to allow for this node stacking workflow where you can essentially merge nodes just by combining them, more like you can on the 2D side. You don't have to use that. You could still use a geo merge if you wish. But this image input has now been moved to the right, so you can plug that in and get the checkerboard texture. Now, the next thing that you typically do after creating geometry is move it. So I'm going to create a geotransform node. And as you can see, we immediately get the arrows. But what happens when I move the arrow up? We can see that our cube has been moved rather than the card. Why is this? That's because we have this new mask knob, which is set to a default token called last modified. Now I'll get into tokens in a second. But what this is essentially saying is affect the last modified node, or a simple way is affect the node above the geotransform, which happens to be the geocube. So with this, you can see we're moving the geocube. We can change that. We can essentially either drag and drop. So I could take my card from the scene graph, drag and drop, and you can see now the card's being modified. I could take my picker and I can pick the cylinder. And I can even use shift to add multiple selections and do that, with the dragging as well. And we can get that behavior. If you want classic Nuke behavior where you modify everything in the scene, you can essentially use the fact that this mask and these path inputs use tokens and expressions to support both simplistic workflows, but also more advanced ones. So I can do /star, which essentially says go to the root of my scene graph and then select everything. And then you can see we're modifying everything all at once. Why didn't we choose this as the default? Well, when you're working with much larger scale assets, say like the Moana Island, and you want to select just one coconut, but you select the entire island, you end up getting a lot of issues with that. So we wanted to keep it more constrained, but you can always come in and swap it to that if you so choose. Now, what did I mean by saying we've got these path tokens and expressions? Well, essentially, these are really helpful ways for you to just use an expression system in order to create more powerful workflows and selections. So by using this as a simplified cell expression language, for anyone who wants to get more in depth, we can create more complex selections that allow for a lot of flexibility as an artist. And we have a number of those examples down here. So you can see we're setting all the cubes except this one, or setting leaf prims. There's much more information that you can get in this demo asset, which is available to you, and I'll share that information later in this deck. But to begin with, all you need to know is we can create geometry, and then we can move it just as we could before. Okay, the other part of this is being able to load in new assets. So here I've just got a geo import node, and it just allows me to bring in a new asset. So here I've brought in a much larger asset, which is the kitchen set. I mean, it's not a massive asset by any means, but it's really nice in that it gives me a new asset I can come in and play with. We do have within this Hydra viewport running HD Storm subdivisions and stuff turned on, so a nicer experience in that sense. And I could come in and I could start selecting objects, and I could say, actually, I only want to see the fridge in this scene. And you can see we've already got all of these things being imported into the scene graph, but I can use one of the new nodes, GeoProve, and at the moment it's just literally said hide everything. If I invert the selection, it's just saying essentially hide nothing. But the last modified is saying, hide essentially the last thing, which was the entire kitchen set. But we can come in here and you can populate that. So I could use the picker icon again, or I could use the search bar in our, that's not how you spell fridge, in our scene graph. We can see we can come to the refrigerator, and I can drag and drop that in. And now we've isolated the fridge, as you can see. So some nice workflows there. And currently we've set it to hide everything else, but we could actually set it to deactivate. So now we only have the fridge in the kitchen set. Or let's put it back to hide. So this is a nice way that we can now start bringing in elements. We also have a node called GeoReference, which is when, if I wanted to take that kitchen set, rather than bring in the entire kitchen set, but just bring in that fridge, I could populate using GeoReference. We have more tutorials on that. Another big part of it, like I said, was bringing in much larger assets. So here I'm going to bring in a really cool spaceship asset that we had. So as you can see, we've got an awesome asset. And actually, this still carries over the settings from when I was working on it earlier. So we already have all of these little overrides in place that have just removed a few of a few of the assets in the background. So this is a heavier scene, and as you can see, we've got it stretching off into the distance. But before, I didn't want those activated, so I can essentially turn those off. And then Nuke no longer reads that data. And I'm able to work with this asset a lot nicer. So the scene graph gives me a lot more flexibility and control. And then it's bringing in the lights and the materials, and I can just hit play and I can just preview that all at once, which is really nice. This is, again, a subdivided model, and you wouldn't have been able to work and import with this in the classic 3D system like you can in the new one. Okay, and one of the last examples that I want to show you is a helicopter model that we brought into Nuke. We've actually used a new node in order to add the materials and the textures, and as well as these lights, which are all USD lights. So they're not Nuke's original lights, as in the classic system. They're USD ones, so if you create USD lights in another DCC, you can bring them into Nuke and they'll have the same values, and you'll have that consistency. In terms of the materials being used, we have, if I come into the materials node graph, we have this new node called the preview surface node. We've just labeled it paint body, so we can obviously understand what we're selecting in our viewer. But here we can plug in all the different things like, the ambient occlusion, the diffuse, the specular, all these different things in order to have this scene set up and lit and all the materials in Nuke. And this is just a starting point for what, we could go forward with material workflows, but really awesome to see. If I just full screen that, you can see those geometries are subdivided as well. And we're using the environment as well to light the reflections in the glass. So the new 3D system, this was a quick introduction. What we're now going to do is jump back and start having a discussion about what it means to create a new system, why we originally had a 3D system in the first place, and where we can go with this going forward. Okay, great. So hopefully that introduction has given you all watching an idea of a very basic idea of what the new 3D system is about. I would really encourage you to watch the tutorial videos and the information we put out there that I'll reference for you a little bit later to get a better hold of it. But with that, we're going to start having a discussion about why we chose to implement a new 3D system, and the goals behind it, the origin of actually the original 3D system, and now what it means to create a new 3D system for compositors. And then really what the exciting bit about all of this is, where can we go next? So what workflows does this open the doors to that we can't currently do? So with that in mind, Jonathan, I guess why don't we start at the very beginning? What was the original origins for Nuke's classic 3D system? Why did we need a 3D system in Nuke?
Well, all came out of the difficulties we had in Titanic, in digital domain, and the scale of what we were trying to do. And at the time, we were doing simple, what we called pan and tile background renders inside Nuke 2 at the time, which were just simply flat images placed in cards in 3D in roughly a spherical shape. And it allowed your camera to rotate, pan and tilt within this environment, essentially an environment map, but using still photography. And that was the extent of what we did. That was about the extent of it. But then we started to getting involved in placing cards with characters or people shot on green screen in 3D space to place them onto ships or a dock or things like that. And so that we started to go even more down the road there. And we quickly realized that because we didn't have a way of visualizing the 3D scene, in the viewer, we couldn't see the 3D scene, and we only had cards available. There was very limited ability for artists to place things in 3D, number one, but then we only had flat objects. We couldn't do, spheres or anything like that.
Were artists really only seeing the final scanline output, essentially,
Correct.
Just modifying based on that?
Yeah, you could not see a wireframe preview of your scene. So you were always looking through the render camera, and if the card didn't appear in the render, you didn't know where it was. It was somewhere. So that kind of led, as we got more complicated scenes, it just showed that doing simple 3D stuff was okay, but the moment we got a little bit further, it just became too difficult to manage. So it was clear that we needed, a way to visualize a 3D scene, number one, but we also needed support for general 3D objects. So we could load in a mesh, right? Make a sphere, a cube, something, an object that production was using. Mm. And that became a really important part of the new 3D system and why that was designed. So in Nuke 3, that introduced the notion of a true 3D environment. So you had the axis node and the camera node and the ability to visualize those objects within the viewer. And that really helped us, users gave them an environment they were used to from 3D packages. And then that led into, we need to render things. We need to render not just flat cars, but we need to render meshes. And at the time, the meshes were not very big. Yeah. We're talking hundreds of faces or maybe 1,000 faces. We're not talking hundreds of thousands or millions of faces, meshes. So small objects, simple things. That was really the intent. So the first iteration of the 3D system really had that kind of low-level support. Scanline Renderer was really designed to only do that kind of work. And it worked really well for that. But then as time went on, productions got more complicated. Alembic was introduced. The notion of being able to load in objects from other applications that weren't OBJs, so larger objects. All of a sudden, sharing things between 3D packages became much easier, and so people wanted to do that in Nuke. But the 3D system, from its origins, was not really designed for that level of complexity.
Yeah, and then you get into how you're actually constructing that data inside of Nuke compared to competing 3D systems or other DCCs at the time. So, what's interesting for me hearing that is obviously the parallels we're kind of going through with the new 3D system of the steps that you do, the order of things you do in order to be like, well, this is what we need first and second. So, what was it? I know this answer, but for everyone in the room, what challenges is it that artists are currently facing now that we felt like a new 3D system was needed?
Yeah, so the big change that happened, and this happened through the 2000s and then really through the 2010s was where it really got heavy. So once Alembic was introduced, people had then the ability to load in larger objects. And that meant that they could say, hey, the mountain or the background hill landscape that has a big mesh, I want to be able to project a texture on that. And I want to be able to manipulate that and do map paintings and things like that. And as time went on, those production meshes got more and more complex as renderers got more and more capable, right? So back in the day, you couldn't necessarily render out super high resolution meshes. You didn't necessarily have subdivisions available to you, things like that. But as time went on and as RenderMan and V-Ray and Arnold became more and more capable, all of a sudden, those objects got more and more complex and larger and heavier and heavier. And so that it became an impediment to production to say, Nuke can't handle that mesh. It's just too big. So we need a reduced version, a simplified version of that mesh just for Nuke, right? Yeah. Or we need a simplified version of the scene just for Nuke because Nuke can't handle it, right? So as time went on and as production scenes got more and more complicated, the inability of Nuke to handle those large scenes became more and more of a problem.
And I guess also
that was really the drive behind this.
I guess also you have artists pushing the boundaries of what really it was originally intended for, and obviously all these new ways to create new renders of layers and the desires to have out of Nuke all that flexibility in post to get reflections, to get new passes, and these are all new use cases that, again, the intention of the original classic 3D system never was really driving towards that.
Right. Yeah. The concept of like lighting, for example, there was never an intention to do any real lighting, but as time went on, people wanted to be able to do some shadows And obviously reflections became an important thing because that was the kind of thing that was not necessarily super easy to do in the 3D packages and the lighting packages, and trying to do something that wasn't like outside of the normal pipeline can often be difficult for many lighting pipelines. So if you just want to do a special pass that has a special matte or a special kind of reflection, that may be very difficult to achieve in many lighting pipelines, which are set up in very strict methods. So having that ability in Nuke, then, it's like, I just want to get that reflection onto that helmet, right? Or I just want to get that reflection on that car surface, or those kinds of things that I don't want to have to go back to, modeling. I don't want to go back to lighting and that kind of thing. I just want to be able to do that quickly on my own. And a good example of that was one of the first really important use cases for us at Digital Domain back in the day was attaching effects to objects. So rather than being about doing a reflection or or render particularly, this was about being able to load in the 3D data that the rest of the 3D artists are using and being able to attach 2D effects to them. And so example would be like a hydrofoil boat that's going down a river. That is a CG object and is animated. Right, but we want to be able to attach water spray to it, right? And we have elements for water spray, but getting the water spray to attach perfectly to where the hydrofoil is, because it's a 3D object, means loading in the 3D mesh. So I know where to place the 2D flat element, and I also need the camera, and I need to be able to replicate the same motion blur. So it's those kinds of things that became a really, the bread and butter. And of course, being able to project, right? That was the other key.
Big workflows.
Yes.
I mean, I guess all of this speaks then to the goal of the new 3D system in a lot of ways. To me, the goal has always been, to provide that modern architecture that allows for the scale that we're working at these days, that allows for the performance, but crucially still allows artists to have that ability to have complex workflow solutions, like the flexibility Nuke gives you to approach, how am I going to solve this shot that I need to add some extra information to, these extra effects, or even whatever setup it is, under the constraints of what compositors are always dealing with, is you can't always kick it back to the original 3D application and get exactly what you want.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can kind of see the evolution of that in some of the nodes in Nuke, where there's a node called Reconcile 3D. And that node was designed specifically to take photographed elements and pin them against CG elements, or vice versa, to get rid of the differences between a photographed object and a render, where there's small differences. And things like Card 3D, simplified versions of the renders. So you can see kind of the evolution of some of those tools from it being a simplified 2D, 2.5D, like a simplified 2.5D environment to a full 3D environment. And some of those tools from the 2.5D days still required artists to do a lot of tracking.
Yeah.
So they would have to take a photographed image, and they would have to get a track on some art piece of that object, and then use that to lock it to another object. And that was a lot of labor. So the more they could load in the 3D data that was already tracked, right? Somebody had already tracked that physical object to produce the render, right? So the more they could bring that data into Nuke, the easier and faster it was for artists to turn around those quick fixes, and less work for them to have to deal with little pixel jitters and, that kind of thing. So being able to load in high quality camera data, being able to load in high quality tracking data, constraints from the 3D packages, all that was really, really helpful for speeding up artists or compositing artists' productivity.
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially bringing compositors to the table, like bringing them the tools that other 3D artists have access to, but being able to give it in the context of, well, as a compositor, I can now use this for solving this problem. So I just want to talk briefly about, obviously moving on, we've introduced this new system in 14 as a beta feature. The architecture behind it, we've chosen to go with a USD architecture. Now, very mindful that a lot of artists in the room might not have ever dealt with USD, might not even be that interested necessarily in what USD is really under the hood. But for the context of Nuke and why we chose to go with USD, what does it bring that is meaningful to a compositor?
Well, USD is really a modern hierarchical scene graph processing system. And the key word there is modern. One of the things that Nuke was really missing was the notion of a way to organize objects. So say you have a large scene and you have maybe 1,000 objects. There's trees and rocks, characters, water maybe, and there can be 1,000 of those objects. And if they were just a big long list of 1,000 objects, you'd have a long 1,000 object list. Yeah. But in most 3D packages, you don't do that. You try to organize them by type. You say, this is my set. My set has trees and rocks and ground and that kind of thing. And then I have a separate section that has characters. And I try to organize it so that I can more easily navigate through the scene, so that I can select just the set, I can select just the characters, right? Or just the rocks, or just the trees. And that was missing from Nuke, ability to organize the objects. And in modern 3D systems, that's called a scene graph. That's it's called the outliner, right? And in that notion of a hierarchical scene graph, a hierarchy of what are essentially folders of objects, allows just greater larger scenes and the ability to organize and manage larger scenes. So USD is really, its underpinning is it's a scene graph manager. That's its whole reason for being. It's a processing and management system which allows you to manipulate hierarchical scene graphs and the data contained within those objects. So that was really the missing piece. And USD, it being a very, very new and modern system built by Pixar, with many, 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 many years of production,
testing,
pressure, testing, is a very mature. Right, mature is probably a good way of describing it. It's a battle-tested, mature system. So we looked at different other possibilities, but USD really seemed to stand out because it's something that the industry is embracing. All the major DCCs, Maya, Katana, Houdini, etc., are embracing USD as an interchange format as well as an internal management system. So that really seemed like a no-brainer for us to base our new system on USD's architecture.
Yeah, and I guess what's exciting as well, having been a part of the development of the new 3D system and where it's going with USD, is you don't have to be super in-depth on USD to work with Nuke 14 or anything like that. Like, USD is what the architecture is under the hood, but at the end of the day, as an artist, I'm still creating nodes that I'm used to, like they now have geo as the prefix, or geo transform, geo card, but they're very similar nodes that I'm used to using. And I think, yes, USD will allow really interesting new workflows with things like instancing and variants. So the ability for instancing to take, say, you were saying the cards on Titanic, say they had a card of a person on the ship. You can create multiple instances of that card. It's the same card, just everywhere on the ship. Or the variants, that card of a person, you could have the same card, but then the variant could be different people with different outfits or something like that. Exactly. Yes. So it's like USD, it leads to a lot of great pipeline stuff, but for an artist, it just means you can still do the things that you're used to, but we can do it in this modern way at scale with performance.
And it unlocks, as you say, it unlocks a lot of possibilities that we were never able to do before in Nuke because the architecture just couldn't support it, right? Because the basic architecture was not designed with scale in mind, with these kinds of ideas of instancing and variants, all those kind of modern concepts were not, because that that didn't exist in the old architecture. It really couldn't be brought up to address and use those new modern concepts. Whereas with USD, we have this unbelievably powerful architecture that we can build on. And while we're building at first a very, very simple layer, it's such a powerful architecture is we can continue building on it as time goes on.
Okay, so talking about obviously what this can mean for future workflows then, what workflows that we've been exploring or hearing from clients have been interesting to you that you think can really empower artists?
Right. Well, one of the major advantages that USD gives us is Nuke becomes on parity with other 3D packages in the complexity of the scenes that it can load. And that means that Nuke artists can visualize and see the same scene that their fellow artists who are lighters or effects artists or modelers or layout artists, those people are seeing in their 3D packages. And that's an important, it's an important idea that the Nuke environment can now be on the same level playing field as all the other 3D applications. Nuke may not be able to, to do something with all the 3D objects that are in that scene, but at least you as an artist can see those objects, and you have the ability then to lock a 2D element to it, or render out a subset of that scene, or pull out a piece of that scene. But you have the entire scene available to you, and that's a very powerful thing. Nuke could do some of that before, but it really couldn't bring in the entire scene. It couldn't bring in materials. It couldn't bring in shaders. It couldn't bring all the other metadata along with that object. It can only bring in just the raw meshes. So it's a very powerful thing to be able to now have access to all that data that you couldn't have access to before.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I can remember when I was doing comp and lighting work on Guardians of the Galaxy, there was a mall which had very iridescent reflections going on that constantly had to be retweaked and relit and sent to the farm, and I'd come back each day. And just thinking about the workflows that you could be going towards, it's like I could make quite a few tweaks now from the compositing side, and there would still be a need to go back to the lighter for really key changes. But for subtle things, I would have a lot more control in Nuke. And even as a lighting artist, I could go into Nuke, make those tweaks, see them, and then come back into my lighting package and understand those changes much quicker.
Exactly. Yes. And that is a good point, that all the lights that are available in the scene, in the production scene, will come into Nuke. Again, not necessarily that they can be used in the same way that they would be in a Katana or in a Solaris Notion. We're not trying to make Nuke into a lighting system, but at least though that lighting data is coming into Nuke and is available, so you can attach something to that light. You can use values of, you can grab onto the color values of that light, the intensity values of that light, the directionality of that light. So there opens up a lot of that kind of workflow.
I mean, I think that touches on something that I've heard you speak to clients about a fair bit, which is the passing of attribute data through the new system. And essentially, with the USD architecture, all this data, all this useful information can be accessed or doesn't get changed through Nuke. It sits there. And in the future, we can try to access it in meaningful ways for different workflows.
Right. Yeah. So one of the advantages to USD is it has this render, what's called Hydra, this rendering backend, which allows RenderMan or Arnold or V-Ray or what have you to write a renderer plugin essentially for this architecture. And that means that anything that comes through the USD scene and presented to that rendering architecture can be rendered out by those renders. Well, in the previous version of Nuke, if you loaded in some of that data, all that surfacing information, all the other attributes would get stripped out of the meshes. So by having it be USD data flowing down through the Nuke graph, all that data is untouched and essentially is now available to that backend rendering system and can be used and then possibly manipulated by Nuke along the way. So there's a lot of opportunities there then to, well, what if an artist could, say, adjust the diffuse value or replace a texture on a character, paint a custom matte and attach it to a character by replacing the diffuse texture, something like that. There's all these possibilities now, and we're just starting to kind of broach the whole concept of what we could be adding into Nuke. There's a lot of open field there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that I do want to caveat to the audience is that we're talking about some really exciting prospects here, but the bridges to get to those prospects, there's a lot of work to do in order to make these things a reality. So, for instance, when we talk about using the Hydra render delegate and being able to get this data, that requires things like material and shader support on a level that is another step beyond what Nuke's classic system can do.
Right, but the key point is that the architecture exists to allow that to happen, and by adding this new architecture, it allows that kind of thing to happen when the old architecture just would not allow that at all.
So another thing that I find really interesting for the USD as an architecture and USD as a format for comp artists is this idea of a non-destructive tool. So the ability to make these changes to attributes and then push that up and down the pipeline and have that conversation now with other artists and be able to say, you talked about earlier with the hydrofoil example of adding that effect onto the end. Well, what if I can take that effect and I can make some tweaks and push it back to the effect department and say, this is what I was thinking. I can't quite get exactly what I want. Can you generate something in this vein or something like that?
Yes, yeah, that is another very exciting possibility. Where another good example would be doing projected matte paintings. That's an excellent example where you may, again, taking the mountain idea, you're projecting this matte painting onto a mountain surface, and then but you want to have that painting reflected in a bunch of like water that's like a sea in front of that mountain. And Nuke isn't necessarily going to do those reflections, right? You want the production renderer, right? That's rendering the water to do those reflections, but you need the projection of the textures onto that geometry, and any additional work that the Nuke artist has done to those matte paintings to be exportable back to lighting, so that the lighting render, the final lighting render, can now render that projected matte painting. And the ability to then in Nuke say, I'm going to export this part of the 3D scene. I've done this projection. I've assigned the projection camera. I've aligned it. I've changed the texture. Now I want to push that back. Now with USD, there'll be an opportunity to be able to export that data in a much more modular way. Just the changes that you need to do to, for example, the materials on the mountain to get that projection to work. The textures you need to export, those kinds of things are now going to be much easier to add to a pipeline than it was before.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, I think that kind of comes around to where I guess we're going to sort of start closing out the discussion, because unfortunately we only have so much time. But we're at the start of this journey with the 3D system. One of our big goals was to make this a collaborative experience with artists. So the reason that in Nuke 14 you have the architecture of the new 3D system as a beta feature with the classic system still there, so you can do all the work you're used to, is in order for artists to be able to play in that space, to start helping us understand these workflow directions. And I guess for you as a developer and an architect of this new system, what is really helpful in terms of gauging that direction to develop? Is it having these conversations with artists? Is it having just this, understanding of what daily troubles artists are facing?
Absolutely. That is, you just put your finger on it right there, is understanding the challenges that artists are facing, the workflow challenges that they're facing, and the day-to-day maybe difficulties that they're having that, if Nuke just did this, right? If Nuke just did that, it would make my life a lot easier. Or what part of the current workflow of Nuke they love and would not want to miss, right? So some of that has already come up where people really love the particular way Nuke's nodes work and don't want to lose that kind of workflow, that node workflow. And understanding those needs, understanding their day-to-day challenges, why they need to do what they need to do, why do they need to replace a texture on a character, why do they need to manipulate the UVs, They don't have to get into specifics about, restricted IP, intellectual property issues, but just generally talking about the problems, the production problems and challenges that they face that they really would like to be able to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the hardest thing for me as an ex-artist is how do you keep one foot in the water to understand all this new stuff while not actually being in the trenches yourself. So I guess like for us having these conversations and for everyone who's listening, having the opportunity to hear your feedback is kind of key.
Right.
I'm going to use that as a very hopefully nice pivot into something that we have launched alongside Nuke 14, which was the beta page for our forums, or the forum beta page for the new 3D system. This is the location where we really encourage discussion and where you can reach out to us and we can respond. And if you have feedback, if you have feature requests, if you've played with the system, here on this page, we've got information so you can link to tutorial videos that will take you through the new workflows so you can get up to speed. We have as well documentation. This is an idea, this is a feature status to let you know which nodes are kind of still in progress, what might not work with them, what's still in development. And then we also have the documentation available. So whoever wants to get a bit deeper into it, maybe understand some of the architectural things in order to get plugins working or things like that. We've really tried to provide a place where you can get up to speed and then start giving us feedback. So there's also assets here. So the example Nuke script that we introduced with, that's a part of that package, so you can download that and have a play with that very same script. So this is really just a call for anyone listening to know that this forum exists, and we'd really love to start seeing any new voices there and more voices so that we can keep shaping this 3D system with everyone in mind. Okay, so there is one thing that I did want to share with the audience, and that's a sneak peek at some features that we've been sort of experimenting with. Now, I want to caveat this very strongly. None of these features are intended for an upcoming release. They are not saying this is what's coming in Nuke next. These were things that we as developers and people exploring the new 3D system were creating to see what was possible or what could be possible. And it's also to give you an idea of that so that we can start generating those ideas together. And knowing which development paths are of most interest allows us to bring that to you sooner. So with that heavy caveat in the way, I'll share my screen again, and we can go through some hopefully really interesting new nodes or potential nodes. So yes, caveat aside, I'll jump in. To begin with, this actually isn't caveated. The new viewer selection is something we're working on right now. Crucial for you navigating larger, more complex scenes is the ability to then select and get access to what you need. So we're improving the viewer selection system in Nuke, and we've got a number of really cool features in terms of letting you select at different levels. Here we have a 2-tier selection, so I've selected the front of the fridge, then gone into face selection mode, and I can select certain faces, but have only that part highlighted to make it clear and easy to work with. This is all very early stuff, so the UI and a bunch of choices will still be updated and refined. But you also have sync selection, so when I select in the viewer, it would select and sync in the scene graph. Now we do get into some experimental nodes, so not intended for release, just for exploration. Here we've saved this selection on the sphere, and with this scene graph hierarchy, we can actually save that, have that as part of the hierarchy, and use that. So it's a mask that we're putting into this GeoTransform Prim node. In this instance, this is a GeoDecal node where we can project one mesh onto another mesh. So interesting for how we can test workflows for putting objects and colliding with other objects. Next, a GeoDeform node. So this one is really just about how can we modify geo. We can twist it, taper, stretch it. So it's just exploring different workflows. And I guess for you, Jonathan, in terms of exploring nodes, how helpful is it to sort of create nodes like this and have a play?
It's extremely valuable. It shows what's possible. It also stresses what we need to support internally in terms of our ability to process things, and expands our thinking. So, the idea of being able to do real particle collisions, for example, with real objects in a much more flexible way, something that was difficult to do before because Nuke wasn't Houdini, wasn't intended to do Houdini, but, getting more like Houdini-ish effects ability, that kind of thing now opens up a lot of power now that we have the ability to have this scene graph processing system, which is much more powerful than we had before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. Always with these experiments and these goals, yes, there are other tools that do amazing things, but we always want to bring it back to what does a comp artist need, or what helps a comp artist deliver that final shot. And I guess that's the thing we want to really, this 3D system is built and designed for compositors. We want to make sure that any tool we're building is going to really help you with your end day-to-day. So that's why this is helpful. It's a lot of exploration, understanding that. For instance, with this particle curves experiment, here we're able to constrain particles along a USD curve. And this could be useful for trails. So an animated curve, say that hydrofall that you wanted the effect to follow, what happens if the effect followed the curve behind it or something like that? This one here, we've mentioned having the Hydra render delegate. It uses HD Storm. This is using Osprey Viewer. So here it's rendered at, I think, only 10%, so quite low quality. But you can come in and obviously you can see what it means to have a different render viewer inside of your Nuke viewer. And then the ability to output that pixel data. So those were just some hopefully very interesting examples of where things could go. I guess before we jump into the Q&A, Jonathan, is there anything that you wanted to just let people know about, or things that you think is a good message to get across to anyone interested in the new 3D system?
Well, certainly communicate through the forums to us. We welcome any suggestions. Some that we're not necessarily aware were important to artists. We need to hear that to understand your challenges and your needs. Some of them, like asking for crazy, new features. We'll have to be, careful about what we're able to agree to. But certainly, getting feedback from people and hearing what possible directions that you want Nuke to go in is very, very helpful and valuable.
And I'll add on to that as we are exploring some projection workflow concepts right now. So if anyone has any ideas about projection stuff, now might be a timely time to give that feedback. Okay, with that, we're going to jump into the Q&A. I think we just need to switch over. So we'll rejoin and appear in a second again and start the Q&A.
Cool.
Hey everyone, hey Jonathan. So hopefully everyone really enjoyed that discussion. At this point, we're going to move into the Q&A section and go through some of your questions. Awesome to see a lot of reactions in terms of the end section, though I am going to stress again, a lot of that will take a lot of time and work to put into an actual release build of Nuke. And we still need to validate a lot of it and have these discussions with you, which is why we're being as open as we can about the new 3D system. We want to engage with you, have these discussions, and build the new 3D system with you. Okay, shall we start going through some questions, Jonathan?
Yeah.
So I already tried to respond to a number of them through the sections where I thought thought we could get a few things, but I'm going to try and jump in. So one of the questions was, I noticed that when you select Geo in the viewer, it's not selected in the scene graph automatically. Is that a way to do that? That's actually being worked on, as we showed in the preview bit. So hopefully that workflow can be something that you'll enjoy in an upcoming release. Though there's still time to give feedback on that, I think is an important thing to mention. We're really interested to know how you'd like to select and modify and work with your viewer selection in Nuke. Hi, this is from Maxwell Alexander. Are there any tools to match animated geometry, for example, matching to the selected vertex or face of moving geo? And will there be a new 3D renderer for Nuke?
Yes and yes. So being able to constrain something to a piece of animated geometry is an important feature. And while the current beta doesn't have the ease of ability to do that, we are definitely aware that that's an important feature. So being able to rivet, being able to orient, being able to look at, those are all constraint operations that we definitely are planning on offering. And then renderer. Yeah, so the renderer, the current scanline renderer 2 is basically an upgraded version of the current scanline renderer, which is quite an old architecture. It doesn't have ray tracing, doesn't have those kinds of modern features. And so what you'll see in the current beta is that it's basically the same old scanline renderer architecture working with USD data. But certainly the intention is to provide a new utility renderer, which is essentially an upgraded version of scanline renderer. Name is to be determined. That will have ray tracing support and the ability to do things like soft shadows, better lighting, better material support, and high quality reflections. Those kinds of things that you expect from a modern ray tracer. However, we won't be attempting to replicate an Arnold or a PR Man in a full GI kind of system. This is really intended to be utility render and targeted for the kinds of operations that Nuke artists really need, not intending to replace a production render.
Yeah, I mean, the way we're trying to approach the work is, we can only dedicate our time and energy to so many things, and the 3D architecture is such a big project that we kind of have to pick slices of work to tackle each time. So while we can't promise it in the next release, these are definitely work streams that we're very cognizant that people want to get to and things that we are thinking about and exploring. So, I mean, one of these is, the question from Marco, are you planning to add a Hydra render node soon with support for various render delegates as an alternative? So obviously you saw in the experimental section, we had Osprey Viewer and, the Geo render node. So these are already things we're exploring. And yes, the end goal is going to be to allow you to use, that Hydra viewport to swap out and have, different renderers available for you there. Okay. No, I won't go through that one. Sorry, Joel, your question regarding recap USD and all it can handle is such a broad question, unfortunately. I think we did touch on it a little bit in the conversation, but if you have interest in that, there's an answer in the question that could hopefully help. Maxwell, this one's not related to the 3D, but are we going to continue to develop bokeh now that it's in Nuke? So for those who don't know, Nuke 14.1, I think it was, or Nuke 14, I think it might have been backboard. We have PG bokeh now as a default node in Nuke, and it's now just the bokeh node or bokeh node. So yes, we will continue to work on that and keep improving it. Will this new 3D system support UDIM in a better way than the earlier system does? Excited to see more things related to texturing inside Nuke. So, Jonathan, I guess this is a good space for, what do we think we're going to do with materials and stuff like that?
Yeah, so there's two parts of it. One is being able to replace a material with the Nuke nodes. Like I want to replace it with a projection, for example, a projection material. And that kind of thing is currently working. But it completely replaces the material on the object. So you have a car that you've loaded in and you replace the material on the car. And that replaces everything, right? The entire material is replaced. So the question is, how do you work with existing surfacing? So I have that car loaded in, and now I have available the material that's already assigned to that car, all the shaders, all the UDIM assignments, all that kind of thing. So what we are planning on doing is providing nodes and tools to manipulate the underlying shaders that are loaded inside that asset. So you would be able to say, get a list of the controls for that shader. You would specify the shader you want, and you would be able to manipulate the controls of that. So that's definitely a very, very open area of development.
And this is, again, if you share your thoughts on the forum or reach out to us, then that helps shape our understanding of what you as an artist want for a workflow, and we can definitely factor that in. So that's a really interesting space that, again, not going to say we're right there with it, but definitely exploring and going to be, hopefully really building something interesting.
Again, the key point to a lot of that is that the data that comes in with that object is there. And that's a key difference between the new system and the old system.
Yeah, I mean, that's just apparent. Even the hangar ship example or, the kitchen set is like that material data just came in with the USD file. I couldn't really modify too much with it, but I could see it. And then down the line, we can start interacting.
Yep.
So we had one from Marco, which was, since the system's still in beta, can we give some insight on any significant changes that might break in upcoming versions? What should people anticipate while transitioning? He clarified that this was more to do with like modifying knobs and changes like that, which, yes, there's a lot of things with a lot of the beta nodes which will be changing and improving and updating. For instance, the light nodes, they are partially implemented as beta nodes. Some of the knobs are grayed out. There's functionality that we still need to add. The geo card and GeoCube, they have the transform tab on a separate tab. We've already had really good feedback letting us know, put that back, please. It's something we interact with really quickly. And things like that will update and change, and we're going to have to be quite flexible with how we approach the work going forward.
Yeah, currently we don't have any. There are a couple examples of a knob value that is going to have to be changed, and a good example is that is the sphere height. So but there will be very few of those examples where a knob value is going to change its interpretation. And that's usually the biggest problem with script compatibility, but that we don't anticipate much of that.
Jonathan, there was one from Darren Nash about, can a single 3D object have multiple UVs in Nuke? I think you were replying to, but I don't know if you sent it.
I think I did. I did. Yes. So like we've been kind of reinforcing, all the data that's been assigned to a 3D object, a mesh or points or whatever, comes in when you import it through the USD architecture. So at each of the nodes all those UVs that have been assigned to that object are there. The question is really then, are the tools available to allow you to manipulate those UVs, or to say to the viewer that I want to use this, or I want to change the shader to use a different UV set. So those tools do not exist yet. But again, the data is there and the opportunity is there to allow us to give you access to those additional UVs. The viewer, for example, the hardware viewer, it assumes the UVs are named a certain thing. And currently there's no way for you to say, hey, use this alternate set of UVs. But that certainly is a possibility.
Great. Sorry, I just saw on chat and not in the question sections, but Himanshu, you asked if we could do more videos like the skill up that I did ages ago. So thank you for liking that video. We actually put out recently a skill up with Nuke called How to Think Like a Pro Compositor. So I'd recommend giving that one a view. I watched only a little bit of it, but I already thought it had some really valuable stuff in it. Okay, coming back to the question page. Apologies, there's so many questions, which is fantastic. I'm not sure we'll be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best. We're going to lump Rise and Kenneth's question together. Given this preview of particle dynamics and mention of Houdini, is there any plan to co-develop a Houdini engine plugin for Nuke? That is one of those bigger features or far-reaching things that... Go on, Jonathan.
So while we probably will not be offering Houdini engine directly, there are some new features coming up in USD, which are the procedural system. I can't remember the exact name of it in the USD, but that that new proceduralism system, which will be hopefully releasing, I think it's released, it's being updated this year, will allow side effects to provide Houdini engine plugins essentially for USD to do processing. So assuming you have USD engine capabilities in your pipeline and you're already using that to do some kind of procedural processing, then again, that data will be available in Nuke, and theoretically it could also, part of the Hydra render delegate would be running that Houdini engine processing.
And do you plan to open Nuke for Hydra render delegates? Kind of pretty much ties into that answer there.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have plans to update the PRMan render node that supports PRMan RS24.x? So this is, again, one of those spaces where coming into how we can look at, I think, more how we look at what happened in the classic system rather than just reintroducing the same node or following down the same workflow path that we had before. We're actively looking at how can we make that experience better, what's the best way to approach that workflow. So yes, in the future, we will be looking at how to support other things like PRMan render, but maybe not necessarily in the same exact way as the classic system. Struggling with the new controls in 13. Okay, I'll have a look at that one because I think we have some tutorials in. So Jonathan, I'll try and find that and share with you if I can. Okay, so Mihal Rafford asked, can we make it more easier combining UV textures of 3D models in Nuke so we can have more control over UV textures, which is way too complicated right now? So one thing, because we've obviously spoken about UVs and materials and that's work to come, but what I like about this is you're explaining what about the process is cumbersome or difficult for you? And that context is really helpful for us in terms of telling us, I want this feature, always helpful, but telling us what problem you're trying to solve. That gives us more context that allows us to tackle the problem and hopefully give you really helpful solutions.
Right. Yeah. And for that one specifically, when you say have more control over UV textures, more detail on what you mean by that. What kind of controls do you want over UV textures? Are you talking about a UV editor to manipulate UVs? Are you talking about the ability to do merging between UV textures in shaders? What kind of control?
Cool. Well, I didn't think we were going to do it, but we actually got through a lot of the questions already. So we're a little bit over time. But hopefully people didn't mind us running a few minutes late. I'll give just an extra second or two if anyone has any last minute questions to post it there, and we'll try and answer one or two more. But I just want to take the moment to thank everyone for joining and having a listen and paying attention. And really, this whole webinar is to be open with you, to have these discussions and really to say these discussions can continue on our forums with us. Like that's where we're looking, that's where we're learning, and it's helping us shape the direction of the new 3D system. It will take a lot of time to build this 3D system. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but hopefully people are already seeing the value of what it can bring and some of the new workflows that we're starting to open up with it.
Yes.
Having the ability to UV outside the builder node would be nice. Fantastic. All right, cool. Well, with that, one question did pop up. Will the webinar be available later? Yes, all of the Foundry Live webinars that have happened this week are being recorded and will be made available so you can review this and watch later. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. And Jonathan, thank you for being on this panel with me and having a chat.
It was great.
Nothing left to say other than thank you all and happy comping. See you later.